Transmission now. Okay, just it takes 30 seconds. It's okay, David. So let me introduce you now to David Lefkowitz. David is a professor of philosophy at the University of Richmond in the US, and he's written extensively on moral philosophy and philosophy of international law. He has just a new book. I think the title is, what's the title, David?
Philosophy and International Law, A Critical Introduction.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I've read a few chapters that he sent me, and it's coming out. Is it Oxford or Cambridge?
Cambridge, out with Cambridge this month. Yep.
Cambridge University Press. David has been a loyal friend, and he has written a lot. Now he's going to present a paper on political associative obligations and pragmatism. So we look very forward to hearing him. And David, it's with you now.
Great. Okay, well, thank you. So let me just start by thanking Tomas for the invitation to share this work, and to the rest of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in the conversation. It's a very early stages and rough draft. I hope not too rough, not to be worth your time, but I certainly anticipate that I will benefit from your feedback on it to kind of round it into shape. So let me start by saying a little bit about my motivation in writing the paper. It's actually threefold. So partly this is pedagogical. It's kind of the product of a couple of years now, time spent with students in the classroom trying to help them to understand the associative take on political obligations. So, we'll look at consent theory, we'll look at fair play, we'll look at some of the natural duty accounts, I had never quite been happy with the way I was presenting the associative political theories. I thought my students weren't kind of taking them seriously enough, and I thought that was partly the way I was presenting it. And so a couple of years ago, I started actually taking a step back and looking at the kind of Cartesian versus pragmatist debates in epistemology. And that really helped my students frame the associative political accounts in a much more productive way. I thought the conversations were much more productive. So partly this is trying to synthesize work I've done in the classroom with the students in the ways that I think make the associative theories as interesting as they can be, and then leave it open for the moment, at least, whether that's interesting enough to actually be correct. Secondly, I have collegial motive here. So Richard Dagger is a dear colleague of mine here at the University of Richmond, has written extensively on political obligation, advocate of the fair play account of political obligation, the duty to obey the law in particular. And sadly, Richard is retiring at the end of this year. And we have this lovely tradition in academia that when someone's about to retire, we all sit down and point out all of the shortcomings in their life's work in order to wish them well into retirement. So I'll be doing that in about a month's time to poor Richard. And so that's partly what's going on here. And then lastly, is just a philosophical enterprise of merit, I hope, in its own right. And here I have been tiptoeing up to the full-on embrace of pragmatism for a number of years now. And it's come out in different work that I've done, in particular, some of the work that I've done on customary norms and customary international law. And so this is kind of my taking one more step towards that kind of full and open embrace of a pragmatist meta-ethic. So with that behind us, the primary goal of the paper is to defend what I labeled the associative thesis, and that I see as the kind of core claim of associative theorists of political obligation. And that thesis holds that individuals have certain duties simply in virtue of their membership in political communities. And that thesis has come under sustained critique from a number of theorists. And then associative theorists have done their best, I think, to offer rejoinders. I think the best way of defending the associative thesis is to interpret it as a pragmatist meta-ethical claim. And so that's what I set out to do in the papers, is offer a pragmatist reading. So real briefly, what I mean here, since pragmatism is a broad tradition with many different tenets, not all of which need to be or are embraced by someone who identifies as a pragmatist, kind of three claims that inform the reading of the associative thesis that I defend. So the first is a claim about the source of normativity. And I locate the source of normativity in the practice of holding one another accountable, holding ourselves accountable and holding others accountable to certain standards. I'll focus here on standards of right action, but in fact, it's also standards of belief, standards of feelings and attitudes, right? So that contrast here is with something, other accounts of normativity that may locate it, for instance, in rationality, or that may locate it in some kinds of moral facts in the world, which somehow then generate normativity. So practices are central. Right? Practices are the sources of normativity. Normativity is something that we bring into the world, or we make in the world. Secondly is a claim about justification. And the pragmatist account of justification I use holds that justification takes place within specific practices. Right? So there's no kind of standpoint outside of practice, no Archimedean point, to use the metaphor or the reference, historical reference that Dworkin employs, from which we can kind of examine various claims made within practices and determine whether those claims are warranted or not. Instead, our attempts to justify our claims to one another, again, are made within practices, and they're done by positing some kind of practical commitment that participants in the practice have. They may not be fully aware of it. They may not be able to formulate it in propositional terms, or at least not in any kind of comprehensive way. But nevertheless, it's some ideal to which the participants in a given practice are committed. And it's by appeal to how best to understand that regulative ideal that we engage in moral arguments and moral justification. And finally, because normativity is grounded in practices, because justification takes place within practices, it follows that moral knowledge is first and foremost a skill, right? So it's not first and foremost an intellectual apprehension, but rather a kind of practical skill, an ability to navigate specific social contexts. So that's kind of the background, very rough, very quick account of a pragmatist metaethics that I draw on in the essay. The defense of the associative thesis proceeds in three steps. So the first section of the paper, I argue that I try to show that the best reading of what associative theorists are saying is in fact this kind of pragmatist reading of the associative thesis. Some of those associative theorists, I think, would likely accept that claim. So I think John Horton here, I think, would be pretty comfortable with most of what I am arguing. Others who identify as associative theorists, perhaps less so. So my claim isn't so much that all associative theorists are committed to the pragmatist metaethics I employ. Rather, it's that if we read the arguments of associative theorists, a pragmatist metaethics is going to kind of give the best account of those. Where best account here is a kind of constructive interpretation along familiar kind of Dworkinian lines. The strategy that associative theorists adopt, and I try to document it, at least in passing, is kind of a three-stage case for the associative thesis and for associative political obligations in particular. They start out by reminding their audience of what they take to be a familiar fact, which is the existence of familial obligations, like those between parents and children or between siblings. And I think the word remind here is really crucial, because the point of the enterprise is not to kind of build a deductive argument from some kind of foundational claim, but rather to render, well, we'll use the Brandomian term, why not, right? To render explicit what the implicit knowledge that the associative theorists take their audience to already have, right? So first step is the discussion of familial obligations. The second stage is to, say, well, look, now that we recognize that we have these familial obligations, that they are not dependent on some voluntary act of acquisition, nor on some kind of natural duty that is owed to all moral patients and by all moral agents as such. Let's take a look around and see what other kinds of role obligations there are. And hey, what do you know? We can continue this kind of reminder, making it explicit type conversation by focusing on how we think of ourselves politically, right? How we think of ourselves as members of political communities. And then the last stage in the argument is simply to deny the need for anything more than this kind of exercise in making explicit the implicit knowledge that we already have. Now, I think this is one of those places where there's a bunch of places, but this is one of those places where the associative theorists are often misread. When they say, and there's not need for any more argument, sometimes that sounds like there isn't actually any need to make any arguments for specific obligations that people are alleged to bear in virtue of being siblings or citizens or friends or what have you. That's not at all what the associative theorist is saying. Of course, there's lots of arguments to be made about what the specific obligations and rights and immunities, right, and powers of various people are in virtue of their occupying certain roles. Lots of arguments to be made there. There's simply not any argument to be made about why you should be a participant in the practice in the first place. That's the kind of denial of a need for further justification and appeal to some practice-independent feature of the world that we need ultimately to ground or justify our associative obligations. So that's the first section of the paper. The second section of the paper, I look at and respond to a number of criticisms that have been leveled against the associative thesis. And partly what I want to do here is to rebut those criticisms, but also what I want to show is that at the end of the day, they really all rely on denying a pragmatist metaethics, right? They're all premised on a different kind of metaethical view. If I'm right that the best reading of the arguments for the associative thesis is actually the invocation and partial defense of a pragmatist metaethics, you might say that the critics are in fact begging the question against the proponents of the associative thesis because they're already assuming what is at stake, namely, right, what sort of metaethical, what the nature of normativity, of justification, and moral knowledge is. So I look at three criticisms in particular, and I'll just briefly note two of them. One is an objection advanced by my colleague Richard Dagger, and in which he argues that associative theorists can't distinguish between the sense of obligation and actually having an obligation, right? So the perception of obligation and actually having an obligation. And he advances that objection because he reads a number of associative theorists as claiming that the sense of obligation suffices to justify the claim that people have political obligations. And my argument is that he misreads what the associative theorist is claiming here. He misunderstands the role of invoking the allegedly fairly common sense people have of an obligation in virtue of being Brazilian, American, Israeli, what have you. But that if we kind of go back and look more carefully at how that argument works, what role this kind of reminder of our sense of obligation is supposed to play, then we can see that not only is Dagger's objection not successful, but in fact, it shows that it really relies on the assumption of a different sort of metaethical view, exactly the metaethical view that the associative theorists want to challenge, or at least on my reading, that the associative theorists want to challenge. One of the other criticisms I consider, this one's advanced, Dagger also advances. Others include John Simmons, Kit Wellman, a number of others, who claim, well, look, ultimately in associative obligations need to appeal to some kind of moral principle external to the association itself. It might be a principle of justice, might be a principle of fairness, it might be a principle of beneficence, right? But ultimately, we're going to need some answer to why we should be participants in the practice in the first place, right? And that answer necessarily, right, is going to have to appeal to some practice-independent feature. I try to, various pragmatists have denied that. John Horton, I think, is kind of out front of a lot of others in doing his best, I think, to try to make the case that justification proceeds internal to relationships rather than external, although I don't find his explanations to be especially clear. So what I've done is tried to use the pragmatist metaethics to provide a clearer account of what it means to hold that the justification of specific claims regarding the rights, duties, powers, and immunities that people have in virtue of being members of political communities, what it means for those claims to be justified internal to a practice, as opposed to by appeal to some external practice-independent consideration. This is not in the essay, but I would love a chance to talk about it with you if you're interested. John Simmons poses one kind of objection to associative political obligations when he says, look, the real problem is finding a case where there isn't an external moral principle that will already do the justificatory work. So he seems to suggest if you want to make the case as an associative theorist for saying justification can proceed internally, what you'd have to do is find a case where all the external moral principles, like fairness and beneficence and so on, legitimate expectations, all those are silent. And yet we can still justify the existence of some obligation or some other normative incident, like a right or a power. I'd love to talk about that argument. I think that argument, again, kind of begs the question. And I'm leaning towards saying it begs the question because the pragmatist metaethics, in denying this kind of practice-independent standpoint, is committed to a kind of nominalism in metaethics. Nominalism here contrasted with, in particular, universalism. So the idea here is that there really aren't principles of fairness or justice or beneficence, right, that are out there, so to speak, outside of practices, universals, right, which then apply to all the specific concrete instances of fair practices, just practices, and so on. There's just the actual practices that are attempts to work out internally what fairness is, what justice is, what beneficence is, what they require of people. In very much an analogous way to denying that there's such a thing as the universal red, which is then instantiated in red objects. Instead, to be a nominalist is, in this case, is simply to say, well, there's just red objects. And to talk about red is really just to be referring to, right, concrete objects. Anyway, that's just throwing that out there. It's not in the paper, but it's something I'd love to talk more about. The last section of the paper, I turned to some of the implications of the pragmatist reading of the associative thesis for practical reasoning about associative political obligations, right? And now I'm talking about when someone is either asserting that you have a duty to obey the law, let's say, right? You're a Brazilian, you've got a duty to obey the law because of that, someone says. Or perhaps you're skeptical. You're skeptical that, right, you've got such a duty. I wanted to make some interjections at that point in the kind of everyday, ordinary moral argumentation. And here I make three claims. The first is I try to find a place for responding to doubts regarding a political obligation, such as a duty to obey a particular law. I try to find a place in that conversation for meeting that skepticism by simply pointing out that someone is a citizen. Right, so I give the example, somebody might have some doubts about whether they have a duty to pay income tax. Do I really have a moral duty to pay income tax? Do I really have a moral duty to vote? And someone might respond by saying, well, you're an American, aren't you? Right, or you're Brazilian, aren't you? And in some ways that response seems wrong, the wrong kind of response. But in another way, I think it serves an important function. And that is to kind of identify if you like, the source of skepticism. Is the skepticism ultimately attributable to a meta-ethical concern, or is it instead attributable to a normative concern about the best constructive interpretation of the regulative ideal that the person attributes to his or her political community? Second thing I do here is I try to point out that this kind of pragmatist reading of the associative thesis is perfectly compatible with local skepticism of the sort that I was just illustrating, as well as global skepticism, right? So I don't think there's anything about accepting the associative thesis that somehow precludes the possibility of denying across the board, right, that you have a duty to obey the law, like for any of the laws. And I think the way that works is that somebody says the regulative ideal that makes the most sense of this political community is X, right? Let's suppose equal concern, a kind of principle of beneficence, and then rejects that ideal, right? And the rejection has to be more than intellectual. It does have to be a kind of practical stance, although that needn't result in kind of disobedience to the law willy-nilly. But I think there is room here for a kind of global skepticism. And I think in some ways, maybe the more compelling example would be if suppose you're a Black American and you look back at American history and you look at current American practice and you decide that as some people argue, that the country is just a through and through racist project, right? And if you in fact thought that the regulative ideal that makes the best sense, the best constructive interpretation of America's past and present political practice, right, was an inherently racist regulative ideal, then you probably would, right, reject across the board, right, the idea that you would have any duty to obey any of these laws, simply in virtue of being an American, which would in effect be to reject, right, your identity as an American. Last thing, though, is that just in the same way that pragmatist metaethics opens the door for global skepticism, it also opens the door for all sorts of arguments for why, in fact, you have a duty to obey the law, right? And I think this is a point that a lot of the associative theorists, I think, haven't appreciated. So all the extant moral arguments for a duty to obey the law can be recast in terms that are compatible with a pragmatist metaethics, right? So you asked John Simmons about his consent-based argument for political obligation, and that's going to be grounded in some kind of practice-independent conception of moral agents and what follows from that in terms of the conditions that need to be satisfied for having, say, a duty to obey the law. But we can recast that argument by saying, well, suppose that you attribute a regulative ideal to your political community, right? That the fundamental commitment is to the treatment of all members of the community as free and equal. And then you argue that the best constructive interpretation of that ideal entails that people have a duty to obey the law only if they have consented to do so. Right? And I do the same kind of exercise for a number of other arguments for political obligation, fair play, or even a kind of cosmopolitan account. Of course, can't call it a natural duty account because I'm denying the existence of such things, but it'll capture a lot of what a natural duty accounts purport to do. The parallel here, for those who might be interested, the parallel here is to the way Dworkin recasts legal positivism as a normative position, or perhaps doesn't recast. Perhaps he's true to at least the history of some legal positivists, as he maintains, such as Bentham. Anyway, so in large part, I think, like a good pragmatist, or at least Brandomian, Hegelian influence pragmatist, Wittgensteinian pragmatist, right? We can say, well, in some ways, the metaethics here leaves everything as it is, at least at the level of normative arguments. But it doesn't quite leave everything as it is, because it denies the possibility, which I think drives a lot of contemporary moral philosophy, and I think particularly amongst those engaged in debates about political obligation, which is the possibility of providing a justification that all people should accept, right? Something that it's kind of has that certainty that Descartes was looking for. That kind of, we can ground these arguments in something that all people, right, stripped of all contingencies, left as pure, as rational agents, as moral agents, as autonomous agents, should recognize. And then the fact that actual people often don't recognize, right? And in fact, don't recognize because they reject the fundamental regulative ideals, the kind of most abstract statement of the principles you're committed to. You can, at some point you can just ignore that and you can just say, well, they're just wrong, right? And then you can proceed to act as you wish, as you think justified, thinking also that you're justified to them. And I think if we go down this road, then at least that is no longer left on the table. Anyways, I hope I haven't spoken too much. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on any and all of this.
Thank you very much, David, for a wonderful paper. Those of you who haven't read it, it's posted in the website, I think that it's already very developed. And I would like to hear now Jorge's comments, and then we can turn on to the questions, okay? Jorge, welcome, and I thank you very much for doing it, and now I give it to you. Jorge, you are muted. I think you have to start over. Unmute yourself and then start over. Yes. Wonderful.
Okay, now, yeah, perfect. So thank you so much, Thomas, for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here, and it's actually a great honor for me to comment on Professor Lefkowitz's interesting paper. So I'm going to begin just by giving away a brief summary of how I understood the main claim. So Professor, this interesting paper develops a pragmatist account of political obligation, namely an account of those moral obligations that we obtain for our membership to a particular community. Pragmatism in this account is a particular tradition that explains the existence of moral duties and obligations and norms in terms of social practices. So let's bring an example, a non-political, the favorite example in Brazil and Colombia, soccer. So if you play soccer, you ought not to take the ball with your hands. And if you're a soccer referee, you have to call penalty. Those are soccer obligations, we want to call them. These obligations exist because of the regular behavior and pro attitudes of a set of agents. However, these practices also bring with them some moral obligations related to soccer. Do not cheat, play fairly, take loss or defeat without complaint, do not gloat when you win, treat your opponents and officials with courtesy, and importantly, obey the referees and FIFA's pronouncements, respect them, act with loyalty, and so on. So how are we to account the existence of this different set of moral obligations? A pragmatist will reject the common view that we have to appeal to further principles, consent, democracy, coordination, goodness, beneficency, let alone some obscure moral facts that exist in a mystic Platonic heaven. The pragmatist argument shows that this obligation exists within a practice. So if you are playing the game, you have some moral obligations, some both soccer obligations and moral obligations. So Lefkowitz provides a meta-ethical ground to these claims. Our obligation exists in Lefkowitz's accounts because our practices of holding each other accountable as participants of a practice. During the game, all sorts of disputes arise about certain actions, and we call each other accountable all the time. And we share in these debates some common elements, some conceptual common ground. And Lefkowitz's arguments explain what makes this true. And importantly, how can we have these moral obligations, even if we disagreed about what such obligations entail, and even if we are unaware of them. Consider, for example, the obligation of playing fairly in soccer. We might agree there is an obligation, however, some critics have suggested that if players disagree about what that obligation entails in certain grounds, for instance, about should I return the ball, or should we fake injuries and so on, or should we fake faults? So if there is disagreement, some people believe that these disagreements, the existing obligation of the very moral duties are in doubt. Or other people believe that if players are not aware that they have this moral obligation in the first place, so they discount as evidence against all the very existence. So the pragmatist account clarified these points because under the meta-ethical framework of pragmatism, we hold each other accountable as members of a particular community, as soccer players, and we attribute each other obligations. So we share an understanding of that we are members of the community, and we share an understanding that we have some obligations, and we each attempt to provide the best constructive interpretation. So disagreements about the shared standards or unawareness of it are not evidence against the existence of the moral obligations in the first place. On the contrary, this is how practical reasoning works. We happen to disagree as members of the practices in which we participate, but we agree on certain standards in which we frame our disagreement, and we can participate in these practices even if we lack a full conceptual grasp of what is entailed by them. So I hope this is a faithful reconstruction of the core of Lefkowitz arguments. So before moving on with my comments, and with an apology of the self-absorbed nature of the remarks that follow, I must confess some of my affiliation. So when I finished my PhD dissertation that is entitled Normal Political Communities, a Harshian Theory of Non-State Law, so one of the readers suggested that I should change the Harshian part for the pragmatist one. So because actually was creating a pragmatist view. So at that moment, I felt like the miser from Moliere's play, that guy who was not aware, who was speaking in prose, not in verse. Like the miser, I was not aware that a great deal of what I was speaking was pragmatism. So it is not a surprise that I am in a great deal of agreement with Lefkowitz's proposal. So it makes it a bit difficult to write a comment. So I'm just inclined to say, yes, I agree. And there are important things to learn from the pragmatist account of political obligations, and how the meta-ethical reconstruction provide the shared ground in which further debates, specific debates about the different justifications arise. However, I'm going to give 3 comments, but they shouldn't be read like comments or criticisms, but doubts that or queries that a fellow pragmatist can have towards Lefkowitz's individual position. So here's the first one. The first one concerned with the very idea of political community. So the kind of community that gives rise to these political obligations. So this is a question in which I'm particularly interested because it's the key notion I have been working. When we talk about practices, we necessarily talk about communities, which are the people whose behavior and pro-attitude give rise to the practices. Some of these communities are non-political, like the communities of soccer players. Some are political, and Lefkowitz doesn't provide us an indication of those theory, but we rely on the examples. States like Colombia, Canada, and Brazil are political communities. And we could say also like past, like the Roman Empire, the Inca Empire, and if you wish, transnational communities are political communities. The question of political obligation inquires then about we as in which of these, in which the subjects of those communities have a duty to comply with their commands. That is, when do we have a duty to pay taxes, do military service, and so on, and in which circumstances we can disobey them. My problem here is not that the absence of, is not merely noting the absence of an account of political community, but a proper account of political community might affect the emergence of political obligations. So let me say a bit more. So political communities, as I understand them at least, seems to be different from non-political communities because of 3 features. First, they use strong form of social pressure or coercion, which are not available to non-political ones. Second, they are to some extent unavoidable. We have to pertain to some political community in the world, while on the other hand, we choose to be soccer players. And thirdly, and more importantly, political communities are commonly constituted by what I will call the concentrated pressure of officials. That is as Hart suggested, a political community might exist if officials only accept the constitutive rules of the practice and use force to compel others, which might not accept the rules but simply comply with them. And these 3 features, so just to be clear, this is an account of the minimal conditions, not the recommended ones. And these 3 features matter because if we take here, So a new set of distinctions might arise. So will the pragmatists recognize moral obligations to all members of the communities, including the alienated ones who have not accepted the constitutive rules of the practice? Or do moral obligations arise in situations in which participants have no input to the community's norms, such as kleptocratic states or non-democratic regimes? Or do moral obligations require some further elements, such as correlative duties from the state? That is, I have only moral obligations to those political communities that guarantees me and my fellow citizens certain basic goods? Or do moral obligations persist even if states distinguishes unjustly between individuals? So these are not cases in which there are different understanding of the shared ideal. This seems to be cases in which there are different ideals from different individuals. So to repeat the point, to simplify the point, without an account of the contours of political community, it might be difficult to understand how moral obligations can arise in certain practices and to whom. So the second point concerns to the pragmatist reading of moral obligations. The key to the pragmatist project is that the justification have to be internal to the practice and not necessarily, although it could, make reference to practice-independent values. However, I do not think like the opponent of the pragmatist, let's call it foundationalist, would simply deny the absence of practice-based considerations or the relevance in the explanation of moral considerations. I think the objection, I think this is what he was mentioning, Professor Lefkowitz with his reference to Simmons. The objection is whether practice-based considerations are sufficient. To use the prosaic examples, so the foundationalists might say that soccer-based considerations are not autonomous or detached from the realm of practical reasoning. So your moral obligations as a soccer player are not autonomous from your moral obligations of being a good human being and so on. So here, of course, there is once again a metaethical disagreement, because a pragmatist will say that there is no foundational element from which we can ground those obligations. So perhaps we can provide the same point with a pragmatist key. So for pragmatists, we can explain all sorts of human practices, like science, the practice of argumentations in terms of practices. So all of them can be. So, but we can distinguish certain practices, different practices with different practices of holding each other accountable. So for example, the practice of soccer has some internal considerations in which we hold each other accountable, and there is a general practice of moral argumentation or practical reasoning in which we hold each other accountable. So the best internal soccer-based considerations are relevant to explain soccer moral obligations, but they are not sufficient. We need to recur to this meta-level practice, which is not limited to soccer, to provide the best account of the moral obligation. And this leads me to my final point, that partly grounds the two previous one. So the previous one. So while reading the paper, I noted that Professor Lefkowitz, while relying on Dworkin, is a strange. It would be a strange reading of Dworkin. On the one hand, he suggests that justification occur within specific practices, and the point is repeated several times during the paper. Justification for the pragmatist is specific. But contra Dworkin, he allows for a metaethical formulation that doesn't seem to be really clear, doesn't seem to accord fully with the whole Dworkinian account, in which there is no metaethical point of view, but everything is applied ethics to any specific case. So this is a third doubt. So in principle, nothing seems to preclude the possibility about a practice-independent assessment of moral obligations. So to bring the classic example is the roles of executioners, these morally iniquitous roles, the executioner of the professional torturer. So there are some internal elements to those practices, and there are some elements in which we can consider those agents as participants of the political communities. However, there is also an intuitive sense in which we can provide non-practice-based assessments or observer justifications or Archimedean evaluations from their moral obligations. That is, what should those people, from like all things considered, what should they do, or whether do they have a moral obligation to do what they are doing. So in conclusion, I find Professor Lefkowitz a wonderful contribution to the project of the pragmatist political philosophy, which is the one I believe I want to contribute in the future. However, I have lighted three questions. What is the conception of political community, and how does it influence the existence of political obligations for different individuals? Are practice-based considerations sufficient to explain the existence of political obligations? And thirdly, is there what would be the role for non-practice-based considerations in the pragmatist account of moral justification? So thank you so much. Those were the terms of my comment.
Thank you, Jorge, for the very nice comments and questions. And I will just turn it off to turn the words to David so he can react to this. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, just say it in the chat and I will organize a queue. Okay, thanks, David.
Yeah, Jorge, thank you so much for for the comments. And let me try to be quick here. So first on the question of political community, I think there was maybe two different concerns here. One is, well, one seemed to have a question about what's going to make a political community legitimate. And for me, that may vary depending on the actor. So might there be a state in which some members of that state, right, view its practices as legitimate, which is to say that they attribute to those practices of government a certain kind of regulative ideal, and they see it, if not perfectly, living up to that ideal, at least as living up to it well enough that it merits their kind of participation in it. And then there might be other of those who are both identified by, let's suppose that first set is largely officials, right? To take the Hardian extreme example, right? So the officials view the practice of government therein as legitimate, right? They take the standards set by the law as more or less describing what is appropriate or inappropriate. And then there's the ruled who don't, right? Who, when the regulative ideal that they attribute to that practice of government is maybe, say, not the same one as the officials. The officials might say, well, we're treating everyone equally here, but the ruled look at it and say, actually, that doesn't really look like that's the regulative ideal that's informing your actions at all. Really, it's a kind of race-based one or something like that, right? That treats certain people as inherently morally superior to others. So then they won't view the law as legitimate. They won't take it as a practical matter to be standards of appropriate and inappropriate conduct. Instead, they're going to look at it as an indicator of the costs and benefits of engaging in particular types of conduct, right? So if the law says don't do X, they won't treat that law as indicating that it is not appropriate to do X. Instead, they're going to see it as indicating the price of doing X, right? The law might still, by providing those kinds of prudential that kind of prudential information, might still actually be quite effective at producing a certain kind of social order, right? And the officials may treat the ruled as members of the political community, but the ruled won't see themselves that way. So that's kind of, I think, well, unfortunately, in some states, I think that's just an accurate description of what's going on, right? But in other places, this might be a more extreme version of what's going on in other places. And in some states, maybe nothing like that is going on. Even those who feel somewhat alienated from the political community that they're part of, right? They disagree with many aspects of its government, which they don't think follow from the regulative ideal that lies at the core of the political community. Nevertheless, they might still think, I got a lot of problems here, but I'm still committed to this project. Right? So the first point on political community. Second point, lots of different communities are going to be nested. So the soccer community might be nested in a larger political community. And I'm not an expert on soccer here, but it wouldn't surprise me if, because local soccer practices are nested in larger but still local political moral practices, that a certain behavior that is deemed to be unfair in one local soccer community won't be deemed to be unfair in another one, because those two soccer communities are embedded in two different local political moral practices that have different understandings of what exactly fairness requires of participants in those practices. But more generally, I want to say that some practices are nested in larger ones, but also there are going to be some practices that are overlapping and sometimes conflicting. The modern state, claims, at least asserts that it has the authority to be the final arbiter in terms of any kinds of conflicts. So you may know there's the literature on legal pluralism, which, right, there's a weak and a strong form of legal pluralism. The weak says the liberal order permits lots of pluralism, but the liberal order at the end of the day, the liberal state at the end of the day, gets to demarcate what the limits of pluralism are. That would be a kind of weak legal pluralism. And then a stronger one would deny that there's any actor, including the state, which either de facto or de jure actually kind of has the final say when there are conflicts between different normative orders. Actually, let me just stop there because I want to make sure others get a chance. But thank you again for the excellent feedback.
Thank you, David. Brian, would you like to say anything because you don't have much time?
What I'd like to say was a lovely paper and a great comment, and I have to leave right now. So, but thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for showing up.
Thanks for organizing this and all the other ones.
Okay, good to see you, Brian. I would have a question, David. Not actually a question; it's just a comment on the question that you asked us to comment on the counter argument by Simons, and he says that we need to find a case where there are no external moral principles at stake. Or where the external moral principles are silent. I think that this just puts the pragmatic methodology on its head, but it's wrong because we don't have the burden to do that. He's the one who has the burden to ask us for a moral principle that is unrelated to our social practices. I will quote here just Raz. Raz is not the model of a pragmatist, but what he says in the practice of value and engaging reason is that values are related. Big values are related with small values, and social practices impact on values and create new values and new ways to evaluate things. I think that Simon would have a burden to find an external value that is not related or impacted by social practice to explain the content of the norms that are implicit in the social practice. I don't think that you have this burden. I think that he's the one who has the burden because a pragmatist metaethics, if I understand it right, is a metaethics that takes the priority of social practice. So you begin your explanation accounting for the social practice that you want to explain. I think he proceeds the other way around. He thinks that you begin with metaphysical intuitions and then you explain everything, including your social practice, on the basis of these metaphysical intuitions. And I think that this is not the way to explain metaethics. And I think that probably you will have a very good response to him. I would like to hear you about this.
Yeah, so I think you're right, but I wonder whether there's just two question begging positions you can take here, right? So you can either say, well, unless you come up with an example of a moral obligation, right, where there's no kind of general principle that we think applies to moral agents as such, and you haven't proved that you can actually generate from the internal to the relationship itself, right, a justification for an obligation. Or as you said, right, we could go the other way around and say to Simons, well, unless you can give us a case in which we can't point to any actual practice, right, or association in order to give an account of why this is appropriate, right? We can only point to some kind of principles that apply to us all as moral agents, pure moral agents or something like that. Then you haven't made your case. But I think these are just in some way, and maybe this is just where we are, right? We just kind of reach bottom and we have two opposite parties asserting one way or the other. But I do want to be careful because someone who thinks there are principles that applies to us as moral agents might also agree that in most circumstances, maybe even all circumstances, right, in order to make those principles, abstract principles, concrete, we do need, right, social practices. So if you think a principle of fairness, take that concept, right, treating like cases alike, right, you might argue that that demand applies to us simply as moral agents. We are bound, if we are going to treat others fairly, to treat like cases alike, right? But absent any kind of practice, whether it's the soccer match or whatever, right, we can't actually add any content to, right, this claim that we need to treat like cases alike. And I could imagine, someone saying, well, that's true, right? But the normativity, the oomph, the kind of why you have to do this specific act, this content act of fairness, well, that's because as a moral agent per se, you are bound by a norm that says treat like cases alike. I still want to resist that, but
I think that you can proceed the way that we proceed any practical argument. We start with what we got before. There is this historical dimension. I remember a paper that you wrote more than 10 years ago on the objection to the chronological paradox in international law. The idea that how does a custom emerge if you first have to acknowledge the custom before claiming something on the basis of a custom. And I think that the way you do it is you look at the commitments that the people make. And sometimes we are not aware of all of the commitments that we undertook. We may be wrong about our commitments. And I think that this is where the working gets it right and the positivists get it wrong. When the working asks the question, how law is like literature, he doesn't ask the question, what grounds the law? He wants to ask how we can argue about the law, considering that we are members of the legal practice. And even though we argue from the internal point of view, we can retain the most important thing in any theory, which is the right-wrong picture. The idea that we might be wrong. How can we be wrong from the internal point of view of the practice if we contradict some of the commitments that we undertook just by participating in the practice? And I would say that the only thing that I missed in your paper, in your brilliant paper, which I think it's wonderful, I missed it perhaps a little bit more of Brandon. You quoted here in your talk, but not in your paper, because Brandon puts it very clear. And also Habermas, when he talks about universal pragmatics. What is universal pragmatics? That the question is that to participate in a discursive practice, you must undertake some commitments of reciprocity, equality. We all are accountable. We all, when we put forward a claim, we put ourselves under the authority of the norms that we are trying to vindicate through the discourse. So these ideas of reciprocity, they are all that we need. And once you add the idea to the idea of universal pragmatics, the historical dimension, which is something that you argued in your earlier paper on the chronological paradox, you should bring this up here too, because you would explain that when you argue about a value, you do it in media res, to say the way that our common friend Gerald Postma likes to do it. So you begin with what you got, and that's all that you need. The burden lies with Simons and the guys who wants to claim that you need some independent value in order to make sense of what we do. So that's I think that this is really a paper that persuaded me. It's rarely in these kind of seminars, because most of the people, they come from metaphysical or conceptual intuitions, and they come from the background of conceptual methodology. And I think that this is not the way we should do it. Yeah. Okay, let's.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, well, I can't disagree with this being a fantastic paper, so thank you. But you know, a couple of things. One is, I think along the lines that you're suggesting, I want to show just how much room there is for criticism without having to step all the way outside the practice, which I think we can't do. Right. And so this is kind of part of the pedagogical rationale for the paper in the first place, because one of the things I find that worries my students when they start engaging with this topic is this idea that they won't have a perspective from which they can criticize the practice, the actual practices that people are embedded in. But I think once they see that you can criticize any part of the practice, you just can't criticize the whole thing at once, right? You can't get off Nora's boat and stand out there on the water and then reconstruct from outside. But once they see that everything still is in a sense, up for grabs. Everything is still subject to critical assessment. That does tend to assuage a lot of the concerns, which I think are what drive many people in the first place, to want this kind of standpoint outside the practice, this kind of Descartesian, firm foundation from which we can then that we can assess everything. Another thing, though, is this project also picks up on something I think that Jorge mentioned. This project leaves a lot of room for saying, I'm not actually part of this practice. This practice is not one in which norms of reciprocity are holding or anything like that. This is pure oppression. There are insiders and there are participants in the practice. There's others, right, who are not participants, who are instead being oppressed, right, or something like that. So, and I think it also leaves room for kind of discoveries of false consciousness, right? So thinking all along that your political community was really committed to a certain regulative ideal that it professed, and then one day you kind of look around and you say, you know what, though, I don't think that's really what's going on, right? And then saying, well, what ideal, if I attribute it to this practice, would make most sense of what I actually am seeing, right? And finding, well, this practice is actually not one that I'm prepared to be committed to.
Thanks, thanks, David. We got two people in the queue for making questions. The first one is Dan Trio. Dan.
Hi, David. Do you mind if I stay off camera? I mean, I can turn it on, but I will. Okay. Bye. Thank you very much for this. I really enjoyed it, and as you can, obviously there's links between the paper I presented in this very forum a couple of not that long ago, and this is also an opportunity for me to thank you for that conversation we had afterwards and the email that I think I did not respond to. So thanks for all that. And beyond this, I find the basic story quite compelling. So far it's all great. And so I don't want to challenge you, like to say, oh, I think you're wrong, but rather to ask you, what do you think about, and the about is the following. So, and it sort of relates to issues that I'm kind of thinking about in the context of Dworkin, but they're more general. So, So there is a kind of claim that's being raised sometimes against any kind of normative commitment, and the argument is put as follows. Well, the moral sense that we have, or the moral obligations that we have, it's all the product of, natural history, evolution. And Dworkin had a particular kind of response to this, which I must say I didn't like, which is to say, well, that doesn't matter because that's a kind of external perspective. And the way he puts it is he actually says the domain of fact and the domain of values are separate domains. And so here, the scholar who has always kind of said, you're always arguing from within, suddenly saying, no, here I draw the line. This is interesting as a matter of natural history, why we have the moral sense that we have, but it's not relevant for moral argument. Now, I'm not saying you're in any way committed to it, but to this. But my question is sort of, what do you think about that? And so in particular, there is a sense that many people, and I admit I always found this puzzling, the fact that let's say a tennis player, that's really the best example for this, but any other team is relevant. A tennis player wins at Wimbledon or something like this, and you see people from this person's country and they're waving the flag. And you kind of say, it's also accidental, right? I mean, A, you have not contributed in any way for this guy's success. And B, the fact that, you may live hundreds of kilometers away from this person. In fact, you may be closer to the border of another country than you are to where this person lives. And yet there is the sense of that, no, this is our achievement in some way, right? So someone who may want to challenge the associative obligation will say, well, that's all, I can tell you an evolutionary story as to why this is. And I don't want to simply say, like Dworkin, that's irrelevant because that's a domain of fact. That's in a way almost kind of goes against the whole idea that everything is inside, right? That's also an internal argument of some kind. So my question to you, and it's not really a challenge. I think there is definitely a way to get around this. It's just kind of, what's your take on or how would you answer this sort of challenge?
Thanks, Dan. So I have two thoughts. The first is just to take the particular example of kind of fellow feeling, taking pride in the accomplishments of someone who, through a pure accident, right, it's deeply contingent, is a fellow countrywoman or something like that. I mean, the first thing I'd say about that is that certainly seems an act, right, a kind of taking pride and it's an actual doing of something that is plausibly critiqued, just staying within the practice, right? So, so you don't have to worry about any evolutionary explanation of why people might do that, either as a justification or as a criticism. We could simply say, wait a minute, we're committed to this kind of idea of individual responsibility and so on. And here's all these other domains in which we deny that what others do shines a bad light on us or things like that. So, you can't have it both ways. You can't have the good stuff, but not the bad stuff. So you can make that whole argument, and that's purely within the practice. It's just a normative argument. All right. Okay. Now on the, well, what about causal stories, right? And I kind of struggle with this a little bit. So I struggle with it through behavioral economics. Right. So, I teach some of the behavioral economics stuff, and I teach it in the context, say, of making arguments about nudging. Right. But the problem with the behavioral economics is sometimes when I'm teaching it, I think, well, doesn't this just shoot to pieces the whole conception of us as responsible, autonomous agents? Right. The nudging literature treats it as kind of a marginal fact, as if it doesn't really undermine the kind of deep commitments we need to get the whole normative project up off the ground. Yeah. But maybe it does. And so, and I just don't think you can occupy both perspectives. So you can either you can actually be holding people responsible, not like standing in front of a classroom and thinking about it, but actually holding people responsible, in which case you must posit, right? This is very Kant. You must posit certain things about them. They're just presuppositions of what you're doing. That doesn't make them true in some deep cosmic sense, unavoidable. Or you can also do this other project of, right, telling a causal story about very complex collections of atoms and so on, right? And there's no further thing beyond these two activities you can do.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, David. We got Thiago Deca now, and then Lawrence Keller. Okay. Thiago?
Well, first I'd like to say to David that I, like everybody else here, liked a lot the paper and the ideas in it. And perhaps because me and Thomas and our research group have been trying to think some issues departing from the same meta-normative view, I think. And so I have no objection to make, since I agree with most of the conclusions you extracted from these points of departure. I would like just to ask you two simple questions about some argumentative moves in your paper, and just to ask of you if you would think that a further explanation would go along pragmatist lines also. And if that is the case, I think the paper as a whole would have a very strong consistency. The first was when you were talking about the idea that without social practices, the content of the norms would not be sufficiently concrete so that they could be employed in action and reasoning and arguments and stuff. I was thinking that perhaps the problem wouldn't exactly be that you would have, if you didn't have the practices, you'd have these contents in a very general content, in a very general apprehension of its meaning. But the idea would be that you wouldn't have meaning at all, because you would have persistent indeterminacy of their content, much in the way of that Wittgensteinian argument that says that if you don't have norms implicit in practices, a way of treating things as right or wrong, and normative attitudes as right or wrong, you would have an infinite regress of norms about norms, specifying conditions of applications of other norms and so on, until you'd have an infinite regress. Kind of that argument that Kripke makes about the Wittgenstein on following a rule. And there's a reading of this argument, the Brandomian reading, that says that the way to stop this regress would be to deny what he calls regulism, which is the idea that we could get along only with norms explicit in rules without norms implicit in practices. And in this way, the problem wouldn't be the problem that you would have norms with very abstract content, but the idea that you wouldn't have norms at all because they wouldn't have the minimum of determination without being applied within a practice that already has the idea, already as a part of it, general comprehension of what it is to treat something as right or wrong in practice. And if you think it would be the reason behind this feeling that, and this idea that you have expressed. And the other regards that Simon's argument that you told you would like to have inputs on, about the need to justify why someone should take part in a practice, in a social linguistic practice like law. And I think that perhaps if you have worked not from meta-ethical pragmatism, but in an even more general kind of theory, a meta-normative pragmatic theory, perhaps you would have an argument to answer this question more robustly than only saying that the burden of proof is theirs, like Thomas said. I do believe that the burden of proof is theirs, but perhaps you could say something more substantive here. And my idea was to take something like Brandom's recognition that perhaps his old brand of pragmatism and inferentialism would really accept the idea that in a way you can reduce other kinds of normativity to conceptual normativity. And such that in a way when we act or when we think we are applying concepts and the normativity that determines what's wrong or right comes from the normativity that that is instituted by this practice of using concepts. And if it is the case, I think you could justify the reason, you could use the idea of embeddedness of one practice in another that you mentioned. I don't know how developed it is, but perhaps you could work with the idea that in a very basic level, there is no sense in asking why should someone take part in a linguistic social practice, because taking part in this linguistic social practice is what constitutes the person in a quite Hegelian recognitive way as a concept user. And since a legal practice would only be a partial linguistic practice embedded in the language game of assertion, if you will, there is no way to make a question about why you should engage in a practice which has a constitutive status of you as an autonomous being, as a concept user. And perhaps if you think that participating in these partial practices would allow you to exercise autonomy in other fields and regarding other kinds of subjects, the same constitutive possibility or a restriction would apply in taking part in social linguistic practices that is political in the sense of, in the sense that involves the recognition of political obligations and this way of justifying it. In a way, as I said, there's nothing new in my comment, but I think since you, Thomas, and I have been working with the same things, I would like to test some hypotheses and intuitions with you, and I think it would perhaps fit your work too. But that is all I have to ask. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. So I'm going to take a stab at answering, but I'm not sure I actually fully understand them, but that probably more that you're more familiar with some of this material than I am. So if I misunderstand you, I would welcome your rejoinder correcting it. So let me take the first comment. So the idea is we couldn't even have a concept absent the practice. So let me try to make it concrete. So we couldn't actually have the concept of fairness, treating like cases alike, unless we were first participants in practices that involved, treating like cases alike or not treating like cases alike, and people either saying that's the right way to go about it or that's not the right way to go about it. Right. So, so that's it. I'll have to think more about that. I mean, on the one hand, of course, I like the idea of saying that, that's how closely our concepts are tied to practices. I can imagine someone saying, well, it's true that you might not formulate the idea, treat like cases alike, without being exposed to an example of it. But that wouldn't suffice to show that the concept itself was somehow embedded in practice in a way that, so it might be that the only way to get access to a universal is through some nominal case of it, but that doesn't suffice to show that there isn't the universal which you've now accessed through having seen a nominal example of it. I'm not saying I find that persuasive, but I wonder. But first of all, do I understand correctly the position that you were sketching there?
Yes, I would only add that the idea is not that you have to get in touch with particular instances of that concept, but that you have to be able to use it, and by using it, undertake commitments regarding the consequences of the use of this concept, that would be the only way to be recognized as using these concepts by your fellow concept users. And in this way, it's not simply a question of getting to the content of the abstract concept by induction, but by a much more complex social structure of linguistic practices that allow undertaking commitments regarding these questions and being held responsible or accountable by the commitments made. And this would constitute the possession and the ability to use a concept. Right. That's the idea that I think that goes in the same direction that you're trying to go.
Yeah, I like that. Let's just say it back.
Can I pick up something on this? I think that if you take your very last paragraph in the text, when you say that it might be possible that all members of the community have a mistaken understanding of something, of some part of it. Why? How? Can you imagine the framers of the US Constitution? They have a very mistaken understanding of school segregation. Why? Because some of their moral opinions contradict some commitments that they undertake when they attach it to some abstract values that they purported to enshrine in the American Constitution. That's how it goes. And I think that this makes sense of the ancient common law idea of the law working itself pure. Perhaps there is a very good lecture that Dworkin delivered in the 1980s called The Law's Ambition for Itself. And it's precisely the same idea. That how we can, from the practice, enhance the practice by looking at some of its underlying commitments that we just cannot deny. And I think that that's the whole point of pragmatic ethics.
Yeah, no, I like this idea. So maybe I just lost track of the claim I made in the paper that what it is to possess a moral concept like fairness is a practical skill, not an intellectual apprehension, right? Mm-hmm. So I got distracted by thinking of it as an idea, when the intellectual description of it is always a kind of, now to Thomas, to your point, a kind of incomplete and potentially mistaken in some ways description of the skill, or really it might be an incomplete description of the practice that reflects a kind of imperfect skill on your part, including an imperfect skill on the part of the founders of living up to their practical commitments of equality and so on. Yeah.
Okay, so we got another question from Lawrence Keller. Sorry if I misspelled your name, Lawrence. Could you please introduce yourself? I think it's the first time you show up here.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm for having me and for having the paper. I'm a scholar from Germany in Bremen University. So it's later in the day here than it is at your place. Thank you very much for the paper, and I would like to come back to the concept of pragmatism you use. And I'm just wondering how much your arguments for the associative political obligations really depend on your pragmatist position. I mean, I understand that you have the pragmatist position, but I wonder whether I can argue for your position as well from a non-pragmatist position. And in this regard, I think it's helpful to ask what exactly we mean by pragmatism. So one understanding, a rather weak one, could be to say it's just a methodological position, that we understand certain concepts only within a certain practice, and that we need this practice in order to talk to each other. But this is just a cognitive position, right? A much stronger position would be something like an ontological position, to say that the argumentative force depends somehow on the practice. Now, I don't really know what that could mean, but I gather that if you say, well, the practice founds normativity, you mean something like the arguments are constituted by a certain practice. And if this is not just a methodological position, but something like an ontological position, I wonder whether you really would like to say that within the practice, there are certain arguments and only the practice constitutes these arguments, and outside the practice there is nothing which we could normatively say about it. And if that is the case, my fear would be that we rely very heavily on a practice to establish arguments, although the practice could be contradictory and we could have different practices. So the question is not only are we part of it or not, but then the question is, does the practice really speak one language?
Okay. Yeah, good. Thank you. So maybe I'll pick up on the last point. No, what we think is one practice may turn out not to be one practice, right? So the upshot of our moral debates with one another, at some point we may say, you know, we thought we all had some kind of common commitment, and we were just disagreeing about what exactly followed from that common commitment. But now it turns out actually we don't think we have a common commitment at all. I mean, get slightly personal and political here. Given the way things have played out in the American political realm over the last few months, I have had some of those thoughts myself, right? About I thought we were committed to something, me and my fellow Americans, and now I've had days where I wondered whether that was really true of all of us. So no, and I think the fact that the metaethical position that I'm setting out there has that implication I see as a virtue, right? That it puts that on the table. The other thing I would say, this worry about I think it's a helpful distinction that you introduced between the kind of methodological claim and then a stronger ontological claim. I think I'm ready to get on board with a stronger ontological claim. And in phrasing your comment at one point, you mentioned argumentative force. And I guess I want to know what argumentative force is. Right? Because if what we mean is something like my ability to advance an argument that you find persuasive, or if not persuasive, at least a reasonable interpretation of some general ideal to which we are both committed or something like that, I think I've got all that. If there's something beyond that, and then there's supposed to be this extra thing, argumentative force, that's the stuff, right, that I want to say that's not really out there. That thing where at some point we can just say, I haven't been able to persuade you, but that's okay because I have argumentative force on my side, which is often then followed by real force, right? That's the part that I want to eschew.
Would you like a follow-up on this, Lawrence?
Well, if I may, I might slightly comment. I mean, my comment would be to say if we are very open and honest in the methodological position and say we are very uncertain, we are in a practice, then I wouldn't be afraid that with argumentative force comes real force, because we could always say, well, we are uncertain about it, and we have to be certain in order to use actual force, physical force, right? And the idea about argumentative force would be something like it's what makes an argument not only persuasive for a particular person, but what constitutes the argument. So in virtue of what something counts as a reason at all. And well, one observation might be that even within practices, you frequently see an appeal for something beyond the practice. So an appeal to an argument which is independent on the practice. So I'm skeptical, but whether how far you get without with skipping all of these references to something outside the practice.
Yeah, if I can real quickly. So I think the way we talk all the time suggests that we are appealing to something outside the practice. So we don't say, we think that what it means to treat someone with respect is X. We just say, this person needs to be treated with respect, and that means they should have such and such right, or we owe them such and such duty, right? Yeah, so we talk that way all the time. Then the question is, well, really, so what makes it the case that this person is owed respect and that this is what respecting them amounts to? And I want to say, well, if we actually start to press on that, I think we're going to end up with something like, this is what we take it to be, right? Not willy-nilly, like we're trying to make arguments that this is the best way, right? This is better than other ways of understanding it. But I think that's where we end up.
Sorry.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, perhaps it just reminded me of Habermas again, when he says that we must find a way to transcend the practice from within the practice. So in a sense, you reach out for something, but you do it from, you use the metaphor of Neurath's bolt, you reach it from the practice. So you're trying to look at an ideal, say equality, political equality, or dignity, or liberty, but you must build with the blocks that you got, and you must explore the commitments and the contradictions and what these commitments entail. So this is always it's a cathedral that is never completed. You have Dworkin's novel in the chain novel. There is always room for corrections and try to figure out what your commitments really entail. What does political equality really entail in terms of districting in elections, for instance, or in terms of improvements in the political system, in the electoral system? So there is room for some achievements, for fixing some mistakes, but there is always this ongoing process. And I think that this is where history comes in, and perhaps there is we owe a lot to Kant, the idea that we are free in the sense that we are responsible agents and we can make ourselves under the authority of norms. But we are also indebted to Hegel in the sense that we must look at what has been done before in order to reach for this in a concrete historical dimension.
I agree with Elsa, but there's the Hegelian part of Habermas, and there's the Kantian part of Habermas, right? And the Kantian part is this idea that you think yourself into an ideal speech situation, think yourself into the kingdom of ends, legislate all up here, all by thinking really carefully during your walks around Königsberg or whatever it may be, or Frankfurt, right? And that will yield the right answer. Right, and that's the part we need to be wary of, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Brandon, there's always a lot of Kant and Hegel there too, but I think they are reconciled in a more sophisticated way. But I would leave that for others to explore, because how to explain this is something beyond my understanding. But I think that there's some ingredients from both that our practices must capture. We got a message here from Vera. Bye-bye. Thanks for coming. I thought you...
I should say, for those who are interested in this, both the kind of pragmatist metaethics and its relevance to debates about associative political obligation. There's some great work by a young, I think he's Dutch, he's at least at a Dutch university, Thomas Fossen, Fossen. And he's done, and in his work is much more explicitly informed by Brandon than the presentation I gave here. And he traces some of this in the associative political obligation debates back to some of the so-called conceptual arguments of the 50s and 60s, the very Wittgensteinian influenced arguments about political obligation. So again, if you found this interesting, either positively or not, I would highly recommend Fossen, F-O-S-S-E-N, Fossen's work.
I'll definitely reach out for him. Well, do you got any questions? If not, I think we can call it a day, David. We have another seminar. I mean, next semester, I promise that I will give more room for you to breathe, because I'm making two seminars per month. It's a lot, maybe one per month. Otherwise, our schedule and our reading list will get too busy. We will get too busy. But so we still have some seminars coming up. We got on the March 3rd, I think, we got Veronica Rodriguez Blanco. And March 3rd is a very important date for me, because it will be 20 years to the day when I got my first teaching job. So we will be back on March 3rd with Veronica from the University of Surrey in the UK. Thank you very much for coming. And David, it was a wonderful piece, and let us know when you publish it so we can advertise it.
Well, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation. Excellent feedback. So thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you. Bye-bye, David. Bye.